Today, I heard the banshee. I heard her song. You hear of the banshee from time to time in the small village of Carlo. My grandma told me about the banshee when I was 5. She was one of them "he's old enough now" type of women, though I clearly wasn't. She told me the banshee will sing at night or day. The person who hears her will know her prey. There's no stopping the woman of the barrows. She will come and go as swift as the sparrows. I was later told that you hear her and someone in your family dies, and sometimes you see her washing the blood-stained clothes of the next to die. But today, I heard it, and tonight the phone rang with the same tone it does, but at 11:48 p.m. You just know it's bad news, and it was. My uncle had a brain hemorrhage about 30 minutes before the haunting ringing of the phone, and 10 hours after the wailing of the woman of the barrows. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of the banshee plagued my mind until the icky blackness of the night was no more, and the orange morning sky was creeping through my bedroom window. I decided to get up and occupy myself and walk my dog Dave. We called her Dave because of my little sister. When she was little, she would call everything Dave. I was Dave, my mother was Dave, we got a dog, and sure enough, the dog was Dave too. Shame the dog was a girl. Dave and I walked into the field behind my house. My feet were damp with the morning dew, and Dave bolted into the wood beyond the field. I ran after her, and I reached the edge of the woods, and the morning light wasn't strong enough to break through the canopy. I heard Dave barking a few hundred yards ahead of me, and I sprinted to find her running in circles, and the screeching began. It was loud and made it feel like my brain was vibrating in my skull. I ran back to the field, and as I left the woods, Dave ran past me and kept on going. Today is my uncle's funeral, and yesterday my grandma's house was burnt to the ground. My family and I arrived at the house just as all the windows exploded. We were going round to sort out the final funeral arrangements. I wish we got there earlier. Before we got there, and we saw the orange glow in the sky, we pulled up outside and we could hear the screams of my grandma as she burned, and the rumble of the house as it fell onto itself just after the screaming stopped. After the funeral, I changed out of my one and only suit and put on my black jeans and plain white t-shirt with the silhouette of a crow on the front. My mother and father had gone to bed, but I could hear my mother weeping in the next room. I stepped inside to see if she was okay. She was still in her black dress with a white curved collar. I went downstairs and saw a woman in the garden. I walked to the door and she saw me. She slowly turned around and walked off. I followed her. There was something about her. As she walked ahead of me and she came to a stop at a small pond, I walked around to the other side of the pond so I could see her. She was a tall, thin woman with a flowing white dress, but the dress was ripped and her fingernails were black. I couldn't see her face, her long wavy black hair blowing in the wind covering. She knelt down to the water and looked up at me. Her face was thin, almost skeletal, as if skin was just on bone with nothing in between. She reached her hand into the water and she pulled out a dirty mud-stained cloth. Dirt was all over the black fabric as the water fell from the bundled cloth. As the murky water turned to blood, her hands loosened and the cloth rolled down into a dress with a white collar. I fell into the pond and quickly stumbled back on the side. She looked up and looked into the depths of my eyes. Her cracked lips began to split as she smiled, showing her black, jagged teeth. A high-pitched laughter came from her throat. She suddenly drove at me and sailed over my head into the trees behind me as a familiar wail started again. Then everything was silent. I looked over at my house and I heard my mother scream. If you hear a wail in the distance, it may be nothing. It may be something. It may be the banshee. Today I saw the banshee, and today my mother died. Number 4. This is something that happened to me, and I still have no concrete explanation for it. I lived in Japan for 2 years, way out on the island of Kyushu, in a really rural town. I was teaching English there, and I lived in an apartment complex with 9 other English teachers and a handful of Japanese families. All of our apartments were 2-story, townhouse style. My apartment was the newest of the bunch. Before me, there had been another English teacher who lived there for 2 years, but before her, as far as I had been told, the apartment had been empty. I first moved in at the beginning of August, which is brutally hot and humid in Japan. It's so humid that the wallpaper in your apartment gets wet and starts to curl up. The only air conditioning in the apartment was downstairs, and the bedrooms were upstairs. It was truly unpleasant, and I ended up having to sleep downstairs to avoid the sweltering heat in my bedroom. One day, I came home from school to find my back door wide open. It was a sliding glass door, and before I left for school, I had securely bolted it. I had locked the front door as well. At first, I thought maybe someone had broken in, but nothing had been taken, and not a single thing was out of place. One of my neighbors came over and looked everywhere with me, but we found nothing strange. At the time, I thought it was no big deal, probably just some curious Japanese kids who thought it would be fun to break in and look at what a foreigner's house was like. That night, I was downstairs and I just laid down on my futon to go to sleep. All of a sudden, I heard footsteps upstairs. At first, it sounded like someone was pacing back and forth between the two bedrooms. Then they suddenly stopped. At this point, I was lying on my futon, shaking and holding my breath. I was terrified that whoever broke in earlier had managed to hide upstairs in the crawl space. After about a minute of silence, I heard an incredibly loud bang, as though something huge and heavy had just fallen and hit the floor above me. I ran right out of my apartment and went to my neighbor's house. I convinced my neighbor to come back with me and searched upstairs, but we found nothing. This continued to happen every night, like clockwork. One night, I was at the local bar with one of the other English teachers. He had been living there for 5 years. I started telling him about the strange things that kept happening every night, and how I hadn't been able to sleep because of it. "Well, there's a reason for that," he said. "Before you, there was another teacher in that apartment, but before her, the apartment was empty. Nobody would live there because a woman hung herself upstairs after her husband left her. Japanese people wouldn't rent it because they thought the place was cursed, so it was empty until the Board of Education decided to rent it out to a foreign teacher. At the time, I thought he was just making things up and trying to scare me, but one day, I asked my boss about it, and he immediately turned white and said that the other teacher shouldn't be telling me things like that. I tried to press him for more information, but he would neither confirm or deny it. One day, while cleaning my apartment, I noticed something on the underside of the windowsill. Someone had carved the words, "Try to smile," in Japanese about 10 times. When I saw that, I think my blood literally ran cold. I still don't know what actually happened in that apartment, but every night during the summer, until I would start sleeping upstairs again, those noises happened without fail. Number 3. I was babysitting my niece once while I was staying at my brother's place, and they had the baby camera set up so I could see her on the little TV it came with. I was studying and starting to doze off when I heard some whispering, and I realized it was coming from the monitor. I initially thought it was some feedback or something, but when I looked at the TV, there was a dark shadow near my niece's crib. I have never been more terrified in my life, but the shadow was clearly there where it had not been before. I ran to my niece's room and looked around and saw nothing, but I took her the hell out of there. I went back to the TV, and the shadow was clearly gone. I told my brother what happened, and he pulled me aside and told me not to mention it to my sister-in-law because she'll freak out, but that he had seen the same thing several times now, with the same whispering. They stayed in that house for about 4 more years, and when my niece was just learning to talk, she would tell her mom about her special friend. To this day, it scares the shit out of me. When they moved out, my brother told me my niece had become inconsolably sad because she would miss her friend. Her mom would tell her she could bring him along, but all he would say is that he couldn't leave the house. We have never to this day told her about that damn shadow, and she apparently never saw it. Number 2. Many years ago in rural North Carolina, a mother and her son went on a tour of an old cave system riddled with mine shafts. Partway through the tour, the two had separated from the main body of the tourists while enjoying the sight of a series of lighted stalagmites past the tour path's railing. The son complained that he needed to use the restroom. There were no restrooms in the cave, so she sent him back to the main group, and one of the guides escorted him out. When they returned to the main body of the tour, the mother greeted her son with a big smile, but the boy froze. He stared at the woman for several seconds. When the tour guide urged him on, the boy shook his head and said, "That's not my mom." The mother frowned and encouraged him to come with her, but he would not. She complained that he was embarrassing her and pleaded with him, but strangely, She would not approach him. She simply beckoned. Later, many tourists recalled her saying she saw something wonderful a ways back and she wanted to show him. A man from the crowd thought to ask if anyone had seen the woman arrive with the boy, and in fact many had. Later, one man said he even remembered her facial features. Still, the boy would not relent, but stared at his mother with mistrustful eyes. Shortly thereafter, there was a shout, followed by a commotion. As the tourists flocked toward the noise, they discovered a very distressed employee. He was reluctant to explain in front of all the people, but there were too many to usher away. Eventually, he admitted that he had seen a handbag laying outside of where the visitors were allowed to walk. He had retrieved it, and rooting around, discovered what appeared to be a dead body at the bottom of one of the nearby mine shafts. The body seemed fresh. The fire department was called to see if they could retrieve the body, and with their help, the frightened but morbidly curious tourists were ushered out of the cave and given refunds. At this time, it was discovered that the boy's mother had disappeared. Employees took the boy back to the front offices until they could find his mother. Hours later, the firemen were able to hoist the body from the mine shaft. Folks were unsure how she could have fallen in, since it was riddled with warning signs, and staff repeatedly told them not to wander off the paths. When the body was brought into the light, all the employees who had been on the recent tour went deathly pale. It was without a doubt the woman who had claimed to be the boy's mother. Confounded as to what happened, but not wanting to alarm the boy, the firefighters did not tell him what they found, but brought him to the local police station. Later on, the autopsy of the woman would discover that there were deep bruises on both of her wrists and her left ankle, suggesting she was roughly handled, as well as on various parts of her body. Some were huge, clearly caused by the fatal fall, but others appeared to have been caused by tripping and running into walls. She had deep bruises all around her neck, caused by one very large, thin-fingered hand, and her windpipe had been partly crushed, though the cause of death was a broken neck. Finally, though the police do not consider this empirical evidence of any kind, she wore a death mask of animal terror. The police interviewed all the employees and many of the tourists in an effort to discover what happened, and in a short period of time, they became increasingly frustrated. Clearly, the woman had not fallen down the mine shaft before returning to claim her son, but the interviewees adamantly agreed on what they had seen. Desperate, the police finally decided to interview the boy. To their great vexation, he corroborated every point the other witnesses had made. At a loss, the idea was put forward that the woman who had appeared to claim the boy had been disguised as his mother, and perhaps had even been responsible for the real mother's death. They pressed the boy to admit he had seen a physical defect in his mother's appearance that had tipped him off to her false identity, but he refused. She looked just alike, he said. Well, then how in the world did you know it wasn't her? Asked the red-faced sergeant. The boy frowned as if having been asked an obvious question. I could see the evil coming off her. Number 1. As per usual, I spent the early evening after work at my girlfriend's house. Well, her mom's house. To give some context, I'm a 20-year-old college student, and she just graduated high school. We've been together more than 2 years. It started out as a normal night. We went out shopping, bought some clothes for the job she'll start next week, and then returned home to hang out until bedtime. It was an exceptionally normal, uneventful day. She has 2 little dogs her mom can't afford or refuses to buy, an electric fence even though we live in the suburbs, so she has to take her dogs for walks every few hours to relieve themselves. Usually, I would go with her. They aren't long walks, just out in the yard for a few minutes and then back inside, especially since it was raining. But this time, I was in the bathroom when her mom yelled up the stairs that the dogs had to go out, so my girlfriend took the dogs out alone, as she does when I'm not there. Nothing new. She's not afraid of the dark, more afraid of getting her shoes wet on the grass. I finished up in the bathroom and began walking down the stairs expecting to meet her outside, so she wouldn't suffer in the rain alone. I heard the heavy garage door open and then immediately slam shut, and I heard her yell my name up the stairs. What's wrong? I yelled back, frantically running down the basement where she came in. She was breathing heavily and had a look of terror on her face. Something's out there. I heard her growl and scratching and something scream. It sounded like it was being eaten. It was close, like right across the yard in the woods. It's okay, calm down, you're safe, I said, giving her a hug. It was probably a coyote or fox that caught a squirrel. At this point, her mom had followed me downstairs and was agreeing with me. She was still shaken up, but she seemed convinced that we must be right. We went up to her room and I continued to comfort her. She laid in bed and we listened to music for a while longer. After about an hour, we had both forgotten about the noise altogether. 11:30 rolled around, so I said goodbye to my girlfriend and tucked her into bed and started walking out to my car. So I was walking out to my car and I turned to look at the woods where she'd heard the scream. Dark, silent. There was a small amount of fog at ground level, billowing out of the woods from the rain, but everything seemed normal. Poor squirrel, I thought to myself. I walked across the front lawn to my car that was parked on the street. I unlocked the door of my '98 Corolla and got into the driver's seat. I only lived 5 or so minutes from my girlfriend, an easy drive. The windows were fogged over, so I clicked the switch, and my wipers made quick work of the liquid on my windshield, revealing an empty road in front of me. Her street was a dead-end road. It was never busy. In fact, her house is the only one on that side of the road. Only woods fill the rest of the street, with only 4 or 5 houses lined up across the street. I still couldn't see through the raindrops and fog that covered my side and rear windows. So I put on the defroster, blasted the AC, and pulled out my phone. I figured I'd find a good song or two to play for my ride home while I waited for my windows to clear. After a minute, I looked up into my rearview mirror to see if the back window was clear. What the hell? I squinted into the mirror. There was a black shape on the edge of the woods, about 700 feet behind me. Had I not noticed it when I was getting into the car, I thought to myself. It was tall and thin. Surely it was some discarded object someone put out for garbage, not one to be easily spooked. I finished putting on my music. I looked in the mirror again, and the object was still there. I was curious. It was raining, and I was tired. So I put the car in drive and slowly pulled away from the house. Instinctively, I looked into the rearview mirror again and saw the object was now in the middle of the road. Odd, but I still couldn't make out what it was. That is, until it suddenly began moving towards me. I wasn't driving fast, probably only around 20 miles per hour. I was transfixed on this thing in my mirror. Is it a person? Do they need help? The closer I got, the more frightened of it I got. It was about 500 feet away from my car when it stepped under a street light. My eyes widened and my jaw dropped. The figure was entirely black. It stood taller than any human I've ever seen, and its long arms dragging to the ground, the back of its fingers bouncing off the pavement as it walked. Its legs were very long, making up more than half of its massive height. The only part of the figure that contrasted its black complexion was its perfectly white teeth. It was smiling at me, an awful big smile. I couldn't see its eyes. I don't know if it had any, but it could definitely see me. Scared out of my mind, I stepped on the gas as fast as I could, not taking my eyes off the thing behind me. I could feel the car accelerating quickly, but the creature wasn't getting further away. I must have been going 80 miles per hour down my girlfriend's small road, and the thing behind me was still getting closer. It was sprinting, its long legs stretching into long strides towards me, its hands still dragging on the ground. Closer and closer it was getting, and its smile was getting bigger and bigger with each step it took. Simultaneously, my heart was beating faster and faster. 100 feet, 75 feet. It was getting closer no matter how fast I went. When it was only 10 feet behind me, it reached up one of its long arms toward me. Smash. I woke up today in the hospital, still terrified. I was told my car went off the road and I'm lucky to be alive. Little do they know. Everyone seems to think I'm suicidal and was trying to kill myself. I don't know what I should do or who I should tell.